China faces a massive missile storm on its nuclear sites after launching an attack on the USS Gerald R. Ford, the largest aircraft carrier in the United States Navy. The confrontation began when intelligence reports suggested that Chinese naval forces had shadowed the carrier group in the South China Sea. Tensions escalated quickly, and what was initially a display of maritime power turned into a direct military engagement. Chinese commanders, believing the USS Ford was a threat to their strategic positions, ordered a preemptive strike. The attack involved a coordinated barrage from long-range anti-ship missiles, supported by electronic warfare aircraft designed to disrupt the carrier's defenses. The move shocked both the Pentagon and NATO observers, who viewed it as a reckless act with global implications. Within minutes of the first missiles being launched, the USS Ford's advanced Aegis combat system engaged, intercepting multiple incoming threats, but a handful of missiles still made it dangerously close, prompting a rapid counterstrike order from the U.S. Navy's Pacific Command. The United States, well prepared for such scenarios, initiated Operation Steel Tempest, a retaliatory mission aimed directly at China's nuclear missile silos, command bunkers, and military airfields. The operation began with the launch of stealth bombers from Guam and Diego Garcia, each carrying precision-guided munitions. Simultaneously, U.S. Navy destroyers, positioned near Allied waters, fired Tomahawk cruise missiles toward Chinese coastal defense facilities. The goal was not only to cripple China's nuclear capability, but to send a clear message that attacks on U.S. assets would trigger an overwhelming response. As the missiles streaked across the night sky, satellite imagery confirmed multiple direct hits on key installations, sparking massive explosions that lit up the darkness for miles. International reaction was immediate. NATO convened an emergency session, warning that the situation risked spiraling into full-scale nuclear conflict. The United Nations called for an urgent ceasefire, but on the ground and at sea, the fighting intensified. Chinese state media framed the U.S. counterstrike as an act of aggression, vowing retaliation of unimaginable scale. Meanwhile, U.S. defense officials insisted the action was a proportionate response to an unprovoked attack on one of America's most vital naval assets. Global stock markets reacted with sharp declines. Oil prices surged, and analysts warned that international shipping lanes could soon become war zones. On board the USS Ford, the crew worked around the clock. Damage control teams patched up minor structural damage from near-miss impacts. Flight deck crews readied FA-18 Super Hornets for continued air superiority missions, and the ship's captain, communicating directly with the Pentagon, coordinated with allied vessels from Japan, Australia, and the United Kingdom. Intelligence suggested that Chinese submarines were moving into position for possible torpedo attacks, forcing U.S. destroyers to deploy anti-submarine warfare, helicopters, and sonar nets. Every movement in the region was being tracked by reconnaissance, satellites, drones, and maritime patrol aircraft. The South China Sea had effectively transformed into one of the most dangerous places on Earth. In Beijing, the Chinese leadership held an emergency meeting inside a fortified underground command center. Military advisors warned that the destruction of nuclear missile sites severely weakened their deterrent capability. Some urged immediate nuclear readiness, while others advocated for a temporary stand-down to avoid escalation beyond repair. However, hawkish voices argued that backing down would project weakness, fueling fears that the conflict might enter a catastrophic new phase. Civilian populations in several Chinese coastal cities began panic buying, fearing the possibility of air raids. At the same time, millions in the U.S. followed the situation on live news broadcasts, where military analysts debated whether the conflict could spill over into other regions like Taiwan or the Korean Peninsula. By dawn, U.S. and allied forces had established a secure perimeter around the USS Ford's battle group, while bombers continued striking secondary military targets inland. Cyber units launched coordinated digital offensives against Chinese military networks, disrupting communications and satellite guidance systems. The Chinese Air Force scrambled to respond, deploying J-20 stealth fighters and H-6 bombers in retaliatory missions, but US and allied fighter patrols intercepted many before they reached their objectives. One high-ranking U.S. Navy admiral described the battle as the largest maritime and aerial clash since World War II. The conflict's shockwaves rippled far beyond the battlefield. In Europe, NATO naval task forces moved closer to contested waters. In the Middle East, Iran and Russia expressed political support for China, while quietly increasing military alert levels. In Southeast Asia, countries like Vietnam and the Philippines, wary of China's regional ambitions, began strengthening military cooperation with the U.S. Humanitarian organizations warned that any strike near major cities could cause mass civilian casualties, further complicating diplomatic efforts to halt the fighting. As the day progressed, both sides engaged in high-stakes psychological warfare. The U.S. released satellite images showing the destruction of several Chinese missile bases, framing it as a decisive defensive success. While China broadcast footage of missile launches from undisclosed locations, claiming it had destroyed multiple U.S. Navy assets, though no independent confirmation was available, behind the scenes, diplomatic channels through Switzerland and Turkey began exploring possible de-escalation agreements. But trust between Washington and Beijing was at an all-time low. In Washington, the president addressed the nation, stating that the United States will never tolerate unprovoked aggression against our service members, our ships, or our interests, pledging to defend allies and maintain freedom of navigation in international waters. In Beijing, the Chinese president delivered a defiant televised speech, vowing that any who strike at China will face the full weight of our strength. The two speeches, broadcast worldwide within hours of each other, further hardened public opinion on both sides. By nightfall, the missile exchanges had slowed but not ceased. Military analysts predicted that unless a negotiated settlement was reached soon, the conflict risked expanding into a multi-front war, potentially drawing in more global powers. As both navies continued to maneuver in contested waters, the world watched anxiously, knowing that even a single miscalculation could ignite a chain reaction leading to all-out war. The massive missile storm that had engulfed China's nuclear sites was not just a retaliation, it was a dangerous reminder that in the nuclear age, one strike can change the fate of nations, and perhaps the world itself. As the second night of the conflict unfolded, satellite surveillance confirmed that Chinese naval forces had regrouped south of Hainan Island. Dozens of warships formed a layered defensive perimeter, each equipped with long-range anti-ship and anti-air missiles. Submarines patrolled the deeper waters, while missile boats hugged the coastline, ready to dart out for surprise attacks. Intelligence reports indicated that China had activated its second strike nuclear assets, including mobile launchers hidden in mountainous terrain. Meanwhile, U.S. Navy strike groups, reinforced by additional carriers such as the USS Ronald Reagan and USS Theodore Roosevelt, advanced into position, their decks bustling with fighter jets and surveillance drones. Every moment was a delicate balance between preparation and restraint. One wrong move could tip the world into a nuclear exchange. The Pentagon's war planners, operating from a secure bunker, developed a multi-phase operation named Iron Thunder. The plan involved simultaneous strikes against Chinese military command nodes, satellite uplinks, and missile sites. At the same time, U.S. Marines were being deployed to secure strategic islands and shoals, ensuring no Chinese forces could use them as staging grounds. However, the Chinese military had anticipated such maneuvers, deploying anti-access area denial systems, sea mines, and swarms of unmanned aerial vehicles. The contested airspace became a deadly chessboard where every move was countered within minutes. In the early hours before dawn, the USS Ford launched its largest air sortie yet. Dozens of F-A-18 Super Hornets roared into the sky, escorted by EA-18G, Growlers jamming Chinese radar. Their mission was to penetrate deep into enemy territory, striking radar installations and missile batteries. At the same time, U.S. Air Force B-2 Spirit stealth bombers entered Chinese airspace undetected, delivering precision strikes on hardened bunkers. The explosions shook the ground for miles, sending shockwaves through military command structures. Chinese retaliatory fire was fierce, with surface-to-air missiles streaking through the sky. Several U.S. aircraft sustained damage, but the bulk returned safely to their carriers. On the diplomatic front, efforts to halt the conflict were faltering. Russia convened a meeting with Chinese and Iranian envoys, proposing a joint naval patrol in the Indian Ocean as a show of force. NATO members denounced the move, warning that any expansion of the conflict would trigger collective defense measures. The United Nations Security Council remained deadlocked, with China and Russia vetoing resolutions calling for an immediate ceasefire. As the world's political machinery stalled, the fighting raged unchecked. In Beijing, military leaders faced a grim reality. Satellite imagery confirmed the loss of multiple nuclear facilities, severely weakening their deterrent capability. Morale within the People's Liberation Army was shaken, yet propaganda outlets painted a different picture, broadcasting images of supposed victories against U.S. ships. The Chinese president ordered a nationwide mobilization, activating reserve forces and implementing strict wartime economic controls. Factories shifted to 24-hour military production, fuel rationing began, and internet censorship intensified to control the narrative. Meanwhile, in the United States, the president signed an emergency defense bill, allocating billions more to sustain operations. Military recruitment surged, and defense contractors ramped up missile and drone production. The third day brought a dramatic escalation. Chinese forces launched a coordinated saturation strike on US carrier groups, deploying hundreds of missiles in overlapping waves. The sheer volume of incoming fire tested the limits of the Aegis defense system. Close-in weapon systems fired continuously, lighting up the sea with tracer rounds. Despite the defenses, one U.S. destroyer sustained a direct hit, resulting in significant casualties. In response, U.S. submarines, operating in stealth near the Chinese coast, unleashed a devastating counterattack, launching torpedoes that crippled 2 Chinese frigates and damaged a major amphibious assault ship. Civilian life in both nations was increasingly affected. In China, major cities went into blackout mode at night to reduce vulnerability to air raids. Metro stations were converted into makeshift bomb shelters. In the U.S., cyber attacks originating from China disrupted banking systems and power grids in several states, prompting retaliatory strikes by U.S. Cyber Command. The digital battlefield became as critical as the physical one. Each side sought to blind and deafen the other's command networks. By late afternoon, intelligence from reconnaissance drones revealed that China had moved several missile launchers into disputed territory near the Taiwan Strait, prompting fears of an imminent assault on Taiwan. U.S. and Japanese forces began reinforcing the island's defenses, installing additional missile interceptors and deploying more fighter squadrons. The tension around Taiwan became a potential second flashpoint, raising the stakes even further. Inside the war rooms of both nations, analysts debated the path forward. Some argued for a decisive knockout blow to force surrender. Others warned that pushing too far could leave no room for negotiation. The specter of nuclear war loomed large, yet neither side appeared ready to blink. Both leaderships were trapped in a cycle of action and counteraction, fueled by national pride and the unwillingness to appear weak. The fourth night saw a chilling turn. China launched a cyber-enhanced electromagnetic pulse attack against U.S. satellites, temporarily blinding parts of the American GPS network, disrupting missile guidance systems and drone operations. The U.S. responded with space-based countermeasures, deploying rapid reaction satellites to restore capability. The quiet war above Earth's atmosphere became a shadowy but decisive theater. In the larger conflict, meanwhile, humanitarian crises began to unfold. In the Philippines and Vietnam, thousands of fishermen were stranded at sea due to naval blockades. In southern China, refugee camps swelled as coastal residents fled inland. Humanitarian aid ships from neutral countries were blocked or inspected by both sides. Fearing the smuggling of military equipment, global trade routes were thrown into chaos. Shipping insurance rates skyrocketed, and major ports in Singapore and Malaysia became congested as vessels sought safer routes. By the fifth day, both militaries were bloodied but unbroken. U.S. Navy carrier groups maintained sea control, while Chinese missile forces continued to pose a credible threat. In Washington, war planners quietly began drafting proposals for a limited ceasefire, contingent on China standing down its naval presence in certain disputed areas. However, the administration argued that any pause would only allow China to regroup. In Beijing, similar divisions emerged, with moderates urging for negotiations through back channels, but nationalist voices demanding revenge for the destruction of nuclear sites. In the skies over the South China Sea, aerial duels continued. US F-35s clashed with Chinese J-20s, each side claiming victories. At sea, sonar pings echoed as submarines hunted each other in the depths. And above it all, reconnaissance satellites beamed real-time images to commanders who knew that at any moment, the balance could shift irreversibly. The world's attention remained locked on the region. Every headline, every leaked image, every intercepted transmission feeding the growing fear that the next strike might cross the final line. As the sun set on yet another day of high-stakes warfare, neither side had achieved decisive victory, but both had suffered enough to know that the cost was already staggering. The massive missile storm that began with a strike on the USS Ford had grown into a conflict that now spans sea, air, land, space, and cyberspace. The path ahead was uncertain, but one truth was undeniable. The longer the fighting continued, the closer the world edged toward a point of no return. By the sixth day of the conflict, the South China Sea had transformed into a deadly maze of warships, aircraft, and submarine activity. The air was thick with the constant roar of jet engines and the sharp cracks of missile launches. The sea itself was scarred with oil slicks and burning wreckage. Salvage vessels worked frantically to recover downed aircraft and rescue survivors. The USS Ford, still the centerpiece of the U.S. fleet, had sustained minor additional damage from near-miss missile strikes, but remained fully operational. Its decks a hive of non-stop activity as flight crews launched wave after wave of strike and reconnaissance missions. The arrival of the USS Abraham Lincoln from the Pacific Northwest bolstered U.S. naval strength even further, creating a powerful multi-carrier battle group that projected dominance across the contested waters. In Beijing, the military leadership faced an urgent dilemma. Their nuclear deterrent had been significantly degraded, and though their missile forces still retained some operational capability, the destruction of key facilities had reduced strategic options. Some senior officials began quietly advocating for an immediate ceasefire to prevent further erosion of China's defense infrastructure. Yet others argued that only a dramatic and punishing blow against the U.S. fleet could restore balance and save face internationally. These opposing views created a tense political standoff within China's own war council. Meanwhile, Chinese state television continued to air footage of their forces firing missile salvos, fighter jets taking off, and warships patrolling defiantly, though much of it was archival or heavily edited to maintain public morale. The United States, sensing potential fractures in China's strategic decision-making, intensified its pressure campaign. Cyber units crippled portions of China's air defense radar network, opening corridors for precision bombing runs. At the same time, U.S. Navy SEAL teams, inserted covertly near coastal installations, conducted sabotage missions against fuel depots and missile transport convoys. These operations were highly classified and unacknowledged by the Pentagon, but their effects were unmistakable. Several Chinese missile launchers were destroyed before they could be deployed, further reducing the immediate threat to U.S. forces. The seventh day marked a turning point in the air war. U.S. F-35 Lightning II fighters launched a series of deep penetration strikes on Chinese air bases in Guangdong and Fujian provinces, destroying hardened shelters, runways, and ammunition depots. Chinese J-20 stealth fighters engaged the incoming waves in fierce dogfights, but us pilots, benefiting from superior IWS coordination and electronic warfare support, managed to inflict heavy losses. The battle over the Taiwan Strait was particularly brutal, with both sides sustaining multiple aircraft losses in a matter of hours. Taiwan's own air defenses, coordinated with U.S. systems, successfully intercepted several incoming missile attacks, further frustrating Chinese planners. International reaction grew increasingly urgent. European Union leaders called for an immediate halt to hostilities, warning that continued escalation risked triggering a global economic collapse. Oil prices had already doubled, and container shipping costs had tripled. The Suez Canal and Panama Canal reported unusual traffic patterns as vessels sought to avoid the war zone entirely. Humanitarian aid agencies warned of an impending food crisis in parts of Asia due to disrupted supply chains. Despite these warnings, neither Washington nor Beijing appeared willing to yield publicly, each believing that one final decisive strike might tip the balance in their favor. That decisive strike came in the form of Operation Neptune Spearhead, a U.S.-led offensive aimed at neutralizing the remainder of China's operational missile forces and seizing control of a strategic island chain being used as a forward operating base. Under cover of night, U.S. Marine expeditionary units landed on multiple islands, supported by attack helicopters and naval gunfire. Chinese defenders fought fiercely, deploying anti-ship missiles and artillery from hardened positions, but sustained bombardment from U.S. destroyers and close air support from carrier-based aircraft eventually overwhelmed them. By dawn, U.S. forces had secured the islands, capturing dozens of Chinese troops and seizing valuable intelligence on missile deployment patterns. China's response was immediate and furious, launching one of the largest missile barrages of the conflict, targeting U.S. carriers and allied bases in Japan and Guam. While many were intercepted, several managed to penetrate defenses, causing damage to an airfield in Okinawa and sinking a U.S. Navy support vessel. The Pentagon confirmed casualties but reaffirmed that the core combat capability of the fleet remained intact. In retaliation, U.S. submarines struck Chinese naval bases along the southern coast, detonating massive explosions that lit up the night sky and further crippled China's ability to launch coordinated naval operations. On the home front in both nations, public opinion was beginning to shift. In the United States, while initial support for a strong military response remained high, growing concerns about economic repercussions and the possibility of nuclear escalation began to surface. Protests erupted in several major cities, demanding that the government seek a diplomatic resolution. In China, where state media controlled most narratives, quiet unrest grew among citizens facing shortages of food, fuel, and basic supplies. Whispers of dissent spread in major urban centers, though heavily suppressed by security forces. The eighth day brought a chilling reminder of how close the world stood to catastrophe. A Chinese submarine, believed to be operating independently of Central Command, attempted to launch a ballistic missile toward the U.S. fleet. The missile malfunctioned shortly after launch, falling harmlessly into the sea. But the incident sparked panic in Washington, where intelligence analysts feared it could have been a deliberate rogue attempt to escalate to nuclear confrontation. Urgent back-channel communications between U.S. and Chinese diplomats confirmed that Beijing had not authorized the launch. Both sides agreed, unofficially, that further incidents of that nature could spiral beyond control. Sensing an opportunity to de-escalate, neutral countries stepped up mediation efforts. Switzerland, Turkey, and Qatar each hosted confidential talks between mid-level U.S. and Chinese representatives. Though no formal agreement was reached immediately, the discussions opened channels for potential ceasefire terms. Proposals included mutual withdrawal from contested zones, verified dismantling of certain missile sites, and an internationally monitored maritime corridor in the South China Sea. However, hardliners on both sides continued to resist any deal that could be seen as a concession. Asterisk, as the ninth day dawned, the pace of large-scale combat operations began to slow. Missile launches became less frequent, and aerial patrols shifted toward defensive posturing rather than offensive raids. Both militaries remained on high alert, but there was a palpable sense that the most dangerous phase might be passing. Still, the risk of sudden escalation loomed large. With thousands of troops, warships, and aircraft packed into a relatively small region, any miscalculation could undo the fragile progress toward peace. Asterisk, the massive missile storm that had begun with the attack on the USS Ford had reshaped the geopolitical landscape, damaged critical infrastructure, cost thousands of lives, and pushed the world to the brink of nuclear war. Whether the next chapter would be one of cautious peace or renewed destruction was now in the hands of leaders, whose decisions could determine the fate of generations. For now, the guns had not fallen silent, but the world dared to hope that they soon might.